Now we're going to transition from public diplomacy to the Transatlantic Alliance. And as a political analyst, this is a topic that greatly interests me. And I want to see what our next guest, Amy Trillard, NATO Strategic Communications Policy and Planning Officer, has to say, because NATO's in the headlines a lot. What is NATO going to do with Ukraine? Russian aggression over there. Again, some NATO members criticizing the transatlantic organization, talking about its mental health, let's say brain dead. I can see Amy giving a little smirk as I mention President Macron's comments. Others questioning the value of certain members. And again, it's a very important security organization, the premier security organization in the world, and the way they partake in their strategic communications, the messages they want to send out, very, very important, are very closely followed, definitely by me as a journalist and an analyst. I follow what they say very, very closely, listen to Secretary General Stoltenberg's comments and dig for clues. So we're going to listen to what Ms. Trillard has to say about the strategic communications of NATO.
Hi everybody. Really good to be here. Thank you for welcoming me, and thank you to the whole Strategic Communications Summit team for organizing such a comprehensive event on strategic communications. I think that it's so important that we all speak together to hear about the different perspectives of the Stratcom landscape. From my side today, what I wanted to do was take you through some elements of NATO's strategic communications and how NATO approaches strategic communications from both a civilian side, but a military side as well, because we're working on the information domain in this linked way from civilian and military. So today what I wanted to do is talk to you a little bit about how we define strategic communications at NATO, how we've been transforming over the last years, and how we continue to adapt, and how we're planning our next elements of adaptation in our strategic communications, as well as some of our priorities for 2022, as we've just wrapped up the completion of the 2022 NATO Strategic Communications Strategy. And before I get into all of that, I also want to note some of NATO's adaptation more broadly, as our moderator has mentioned, questions of NATO's relevance today, where NATO is going in the future. And I do want to just note that something that's been high up on the agenda over the past while is the NATO 2030 initiative. And that is about where is NATO moving over the next several years, and moving so that it can adapt and be prepared for where it needs to be in 2030. It's also an important time for the Alliance at the moment because we're going through the development of our next strategic concept. It is essentially the strategic concept is essentially the second most important document for the Alliance, right behind the Washington Treaty. And it is what guides the Alliance in all of its activities and its core tasks. So that's something else that's coming up and keeping NATO adapting throughout the years. So getting into Stratcom, I'm working in the strategic communications team. It sits in the NATO Public Diplomacy Division, which is located at the headquarters. And I wanted to touch on the way that we define strategic communications at NATO. And that is the coordinated and the appropriate use of all of NATO's communications activities and capabilities together as a whole. And so we define those activities and capabilities as public diplomacy, public affairs, military public affairs, information operations, and psychological operations. And so we're using those different activities and capabilities together in support of the Alliance's policies, operations, and activities, and most importantly, in order to advance NATO's aims. So we really want to use our strategic communications to support the achievement of NATO's broader political and military objectives. And then from the side of the Public Diplomacy Division, what the role that we take on at the headquarters is to coordinate both NATO's civilian and military communications staff in order to ensure an integrated approach to strategic communications throughout everything that we're doing in order to have a coherent, united voice for the Alliance. Something that I've been involved in for a number of years now in the strategic communications team is adapting and transforming the way that NATO conducts strategic communications. I've been working in Stratcom for about 5 years now. I'm now working as the deputy head of the unit, and what we've been doing over time is driving the transformation of the way NATO conducts its communications. And so some of the elements that we've been working to make ourselves more effective is further integrating communications considerations into policy discussions from the outset. And so what I mean by that is not seeing communications as an add-on, as in NATO decides something, NATO's taking on a new policy priority, and then we pass it over to the communications division to tell the world about it. We don't do that anymore. What we do is we're sitting with policymakers from the outset of discussions on any new topic, and we're deciding the communications approach and how communications can help achieve those objectives from the beginning of those policy discussions. And so that's one of these big efforts in transformation that has come in over the past years. Another area is improved planning and coordination with both the NATO member countries, our allies, as well as the NATO military authorities to have more of an integrated approach. We've been working to have more surge capacity for communications and financial flexibility during crisis periods. And you can think of, well, currently crisis management is it's been one of NATO's core tasks for a great while now. And you can think of NATO is dealing with crises continually. And we do need to have that flexibility to ramp up our communications capacities when a crisis emerges. Another area that we've brought in is the increased cooperation and coordination with other international organizations. And one organization that's a big part of it is the EU. We're working very closely with the EU, and I think that we can say that communications cooperation with the EU is actually one of the most successful areas of cooperation that NATO does have with the EU. And I know that many of you might have heard from Lutz Gullner yesterday from EEAS. And so Lutz is kind of our day-to-day counterpart, and we work with his team frequently to address a number of cooperation elements that we have together. A few more that I wanted to flag. We've increased our ability to have coordinated communications towards specific objectives through the development of communications campaigns. That's something that about 5 years ago, NATO was not taking a communications campaign approach, and that's something that we have taken on board now, as well as ensuring a strong and clear NATO brand, ensuring that all of our communications are underpinned by audience research and that is integrated as part of what we do. Something that I also want to touch on is where are we going towards 2030 in terms of communications? The Alliance is preparing itself through a large spectrum of areas, many priorities to adapt to 2030. But what is it that we need to consider in terms of communications? From our side, we do believe that we have to consider the changes that we're likely to see in the information landscape as we move ahead. And with that, we need to ensure that NATO's strategic communications can continue to adapt in an agile manner. The big kind of headers for us in this adaptation is continuing along with integrated communications. It will be increasingly important that NATO can communicate in a united manner. As we work towards 2030, we need to get better and better and better at being able to run integrated multi-channel communications campaigns that we can use to engage with our target audiences in both allied countries and also beyond to other partner countries as well as potential adversaries. We do think that deterrence and defense communications is going to remain at the forefront of interest to NATO. one of NATO's core tasks is that side of collective defense that is incredibly important to the alliance. But at the same time, we see that there are a lot of new areas emerging that NATO is going to be dealing with. For example, climate change and security, which happens to be a topic that is, of course, of interest to many of the audiences that we're trying to reach. So we'll see this kind of balancing between NATO's core business and then all of the newer topics that come up and that find us needing to balance the way we conduct our communications. One of the other areas that I would mention is data science. This is something else that is going to be quite important to us as we continue to adapt, and using data to enable data-driven decision-making. And that will be particularly important as we take steps to better understand the information landscape, the information environment, and then how NATO can best place itself within that. Turning to a few of our priorities for next year, we've just finished developing the 2022 communication strategy, and I was leading that effort to get this coordinated approach to setting out how we are going to take on our strategy for 2022. The strategy for next year, it sets out our objectives and it helps focus NATO's resources in order to address our priority communications areas. It also aims to ensure consistency and coordination and provide communications guidance to both civilian and military communicators, both within different NATO bodies, but also across the alliance, looking to national communications teams within the member countries. Something that's important about our strategy is that it's an audience-driven strategy, and it prioritizes areas that are of interest to our audiences. And we're looking at what are the audience's interests, at the same time, what are NATO's policy priorities, and finding that point in the middle where those meet, and telling our audiences about those areas that NATO is working on that is of interest to them. And we're doing that so that we can work to expand audience support for the alliance. Looking at our audience research that we conduct, we look across the alliance, we survey audiences and citizens in all of the member countries. And something that we've seen is that there is broad support for NATO. Citizens do consider the relationship between Europe and North America to be important. There's high importance given by the citizens to staying. They would vote to remain a NATO member in a referendum, and we have very high results for that. We also see positive results of citizens thinking that their own country should defend another ally if attacked. So this agreement with the Article 5 principle, as well as support for investing in defense. But while we've seen these positive results, what we've also seen more broadly is that over many years, the numbers of young people and the numbers related to young people and women are consistently lower than all other groups. So we do look to prioritize communicating to young people and women as part of our communications, because they are less knowledgeable about the organization. So we are looking to prioritize them as an audience and develop the right content that will pique their interest. Another area that we've looked to prioritize this year is simplifying our strategy and getting more focused. So this is why we've based it around 3 communications pillars, which are NATO Protects, NATO Unites, and NATO Strengthens. And using these communications pillars is something that we've chosen to do in order to simplify the guidance for the communication staff that need to implement the strategy. But at the same time, knowing that our communications need to be simple in order to send the right message and easily reach the right people. And so if we're looking into the communications pillars, NATO protects represents the core function of the organization as a defensive alliance that has successfully provided peace and security in the Euro-Atlantic area for more than 70 years. When we're looking to NATO Unites, this is about the more multilateral political and diplomatic work of the alliance and the importance of the transatlantic bond as the guarantor of allied security. And then lastly, NATO Strengthens. This is the pillar that represents the large body of work that the alliance undertakes to strengthen responses to new and emerging threats. And overall, for us, it's clear that we're going to need to prioritize telling NATO's story through these pillars to the right audiences, in particular looking to our priority audiences, young people and women, and that we need to do this in a localized manner. Of course, from NATO headquarters and other NATO bodies, we can't manage to reach the 1 billion citizens that sit within the NATO member countries. So what we do, or what we have done for the past several years now, is taken a communications campaign approach and provided a framework to the NATO member countries so that they can communicate to their own citizens about NATO in their own local languages about the topics that are of interest to them. So one of those campaigns is the We Are NATO campaign, and it's about communicating directly to young people the benefits of NATO and its continued relevance today in a contested security environment. We have had many member countries join. One of those is Turkey, which has been a We Are NATO member country since 2019. So we are working closely together with Turkey as well as multiple other allies on our communications effort through this campaign approach. One last area that I haven't mentioned yet, to give you a little overview, is our work related to countering hostile information activities and disinformation. Our approach at NATO to doing this is through understanding the information environment, embedding those insights that we have from that understanding of what is happening in the information sphere in order to engage and to tailor our communications to be able to have an impact in what is a heavily contested information space. And then finally, to coordinate across NATO with allies, as well as with our partners, including countries, but also other organizations that NATO works closely with, such as the EU. And finally, I would conclude to tell you that in the year ahead, our communications efforts in 2022 are going to focus in on three main areas. The first is to build understanding and support for the NATO 2030 decisions and the adaptation that the alliance has undertaken. Secondly, we'll be building understanding about the new NATO strategic concept, as well as highlighting the road to the Madrid summit, as well as the decisions that take place at that summit and after it. And finally, communicating the ongoing military adaptation to strengthen the alliance's deterrence and defense against all threats from all directions, focused on protecting the Euro-Atlantic area. And so in conclusion, I'd say that NATO as part of where it's going and where it's moving, it is going to be taking a more global approach. I do think you'll be seeing NATO cooperating more with other like-minded partners and speaking more broadly to global audiences. So I think that it's so important that we're speaking here today to kind of coordinate and learn from each other on all of these different areas linked to strategic communications.
Amy, we have about 5 more minutes left, but feel free to go over. I want to ask you 2 questions that I had when listening to you. Now, the first question is, 30 members to the alliance, everyone has different threat perceptions. Now, when strategic communications is crafting a message, especially crafting a message to portray decisions at a summit, or as you mentioned, the 2030 strategic concept, which everyone's waiting for in the next 6 months, how do you take into account everyone's different threat perception, putting the language in order that makes everyone happy? Or do you just come to a point where you understand that you can't make everyone happy. Making the majority happy is more than enough. And also, you talked about NATO stepping outside of its core responsibilities going forward. You gave climate change as an example of that. Are we going to see a more woke NATO going forward?
I hope so. So on the threats, so of course we have 30 different countries. They all do have their own interests. I would say that when we look at the communication strategy, it's actually a point where we do have difficulty, because everybody does want to pile on all of their different priorities, all of the different policy priorities. And so this is why we have focused to this, moved forward towards this simplified approach where we're going through these pillars: NATO strengthens, or NATO protects, NATO unites, and NATO strengthens. When we're thinking about, though, crafting a message, and you say, you want to keep everybody broadly happy, I think that what's important to recognize is that communications are embedded in the policymaking, and then the policymaking at NATO is driven by consensus. So everybody is coming to consensus on the policy decisions that are taken. And many of the policies do take a 360-degree approach and take into account all of the concerns from different strategic directions. So I think that in terms of our policies, we are working from a place where everyone has come to consensus and is happy with the policy decisions. So then when we're moving to our communications, we are working from that basis of consensus, which does help us know that everybody, all of the allies, are in agreement on a specific area. But of course, when we're communicating, when we're crafting messages, we need to get as localized as possible. And so I think that when thinking about more localized audiences or communicating to certain nations, we will focus in, of course, on the priorities that they have, but we will also do it together with that member country, because they do know their audiences best and their own priorities best. So that's why we partner with member countries on their own communications campaigns, so that they can be telling the story of NATO that is most relevant to their populations. Then, in terms of stepping outside of core responsibilities, I think that, NATO will always be working in this security space. But in terms of our communications, a lot of the time, the things that are the easiest to show are the military aspects. NATO has been engaged in the political space for a very long time. It is a political military organization. But when you're thinking of doing communications, it's about taking the right video or the right photo of something that looks impressive. And it's somehow easier to communicate about tanks or ships or planes and show those aspects than it is to say, look, we're engaging with partners, because this kind of diplomatic element, it's a lot of the time about handshakes or sitting around a table, which is also not all that exciting. So I think that we're looking into the best ways to communicate these other aspects of NATO that audiences might know less about, and finding the way to really show the values that NATO has. But of course, when you have topics like climate change and security, those security aspects of climate change that come onto the agenda, we're very happy about that as communicators, because it's somewhere where in our audience research, we're finding that, climate change is one of these top concerns for populations. And if NATO is doing something in that space, and we can tell citizens that we're working on something that they are really concerned about, then that's only something that is positive for NATO in terms of our communications, and showing that we're taking on the right priorities that make sense for the future, based on the concerns of member countries and their own citizens.
Amy, thank you for giving us a glimpse into the strategic communications mind of Brussels. That was Amy Trillard, NATO's Strategic Communications Policy and Plans Officer, and thanks for joining us in Istanbul today at Stratcom 21 Summit.
Thanks so much.